I read 132 books in 2024, and these are the best of the best. Now, if you missed my 2024 book bracket video, go check that one out. I'll have it linked in the description box and in the card. That is the video that I've been doing every single year on my channel for years. It's a tradition here where I use the book bracket spread in my reading journal to determine my favorite book of the year. And it's always agonizing. It's always a struggle. This year probably involved the most struggle of any time I've done it so far. Go check that one out if you want to see how I actually decided, how I picked my top 12 books of the year and whittled them down to my absolute favorite. I'm going to start with number 12 and we're going to work our way all the way to number 1. If you've seen the book bracket video, you already know my favorite book of the year, but don't tell anyone. Don't spoil it in the comments, okay? I'm watching you. If you haven't seen that video and you want to guess what my top book of the year will be, leave your guesses in the comments because I'm curious to know how well you know my reading taste. Okay, number 12 was Rilla of Ingleside by L.M. Montgomery. This is book 8 in the Anne of Green Gables series. This was technically a reread. I did read it once as a child, maybe around 8, 9 years old, but I'd forgotten literally everything about it, so it felt like a brand new experience. I read this for my Anne of Green Gables reading vlog where I reread the entire series, so I'll link that down below if you want to watch it. But I was absolutely enamored with this book and blown away. It made me feel so many feelings. I cried so much reading this book. And unlike some of the other later books in the series that are not as heavily focused on Anne herself and more focused on the next generation, this book still focuses on the next generation. It's focused on Rilla, who is Anne's youngest daughter, named after Marilla. Maybe because in this book we were focused on a single character instead of what was done in book 6 and 7 where we focused on several children at once, or tried to. This one I felt did such a great job of really diving into Rilla as a character and fleshing her out in the way that L.M. Montgomery is so capable of doing. One of my favorite things about L.M. Montgomery's writing is her ability to create such vivid characters that really jump off the page and to write in a way that feels instantly nostalgic. I feel like even if you haven't read from Montgomery before, if she's to your taste, you get this nostalgic feeling like it's something that you've always loved, like it's reminding you of your favorite place that you've never been to. In my case, I have been to some of the places in these books because I'm Canadian and I've traveled pretty widely through our country, but there's just something nostalgic about her writing that makes me feel so comforted. She has a wonderful ability to describe the landscape, passing of seasons. Her characters are incredibly lovable and quirky and flawed, and she does a really good job of writing familial relationships. And I feel like that was done really well here in the sibling relationships, especially one particular sibling relationship between Rilla and one of her brothers. This book also has a bit of a different feel from the rest of the series because it's set during World War I, which was a huge departure from anything that had happened before. There was nothing in Canadian history up to that point that impacted people in quite the same way as World War I. It was in a league of its own. And while Canadians had been involved in conflicts before this, the citizens of Canada whose family members who sent their sons and brothers and friends to war were really not prepared for how few of them would come home. So that's this book. It was really beautiful. It made me feel a lot of feelings. I thought it was gorgeous. I'm clearly still emotional about it. This one is my second favorite in the series technically after book 1, but I disqualified book 1 because I read it maybe 500 times as a kid. So it didn't really feel like a new read for 2024. This one felt a little newer to me because I'd only read it once and so long ago that I'd forgotten all the details. So I also feel like this hit me harder reading it as an adult than it did as a child. But I'm going to stop talking about it because if I talk about all the books for this long, this video will be way too long. Okay, that's Rilla of Ingleside, number 12. Number 11 on my list is In Tongues by Thomas Grattan. I had this as an e-arc from the publisher and I absolutely loved it. This is literary fiction. It's focused on a gay man who has moved to New York and kind of left everything he knows and everyone he knows behind to start anew. But he feels a little adrift. He doesn't really know what to do with his life or what he wants to do. He is a bit melancholic. He's a bit introverted and lonely. And we follow him as he meets his best friend and builds his own little found family and gets a job with a really wealthy gay couple and is kind of brought into this world of luxury and wealth and fancy parties, and finds himself really struggling with his priorities and trying to be a better person. He realizes he's quite a selfish person and has to kind of push himself to grow through that. This is also a coming of age story like Rilla of Ingleside, but very different. It has some really surprisingly wholesome friendships that I just absolutely adored. I thought it was written really beautifully. I felt very emotionally invested in this story, and I really loved it. So, highly recommend In Tongues. If you're a fan of literary fiction, queer fiction, contemporary coming of age stories, I thought it was great. Next up is Enter Ghost by Isabella Hammad. Isabella Hammad is a Palestinian British author, and this is the story of a Palestinian British woman who is an actress in London, and her sister lives in Palestine, and she goes to visit her sister in Palestine, kind of gets drawn into a production of Hamlet on the West Bank, experiences a lot of things that she maybe saw in passing as a child when her family would visit Palestine, but with the wider eyes of adulthood and more context, more understanding of the situation politically, and she develops kind of like In Tongues, a found family, as you often do for anyone out there who has done theater like I have. You really develop a found family with a cast of a show through the rehearsal process and performances, and in this case it's deepened even further, or it's even more intense because of what they're up against and what they're facing in an attempt to put on the show. I really loved this. This was so up my alley as a former actor, as someone with a theater degree, as someone who loves Shakespeare, and Hamlet is one of my favorite Shakespearean plays. All of that felt very familiar and was very right up my alley, I guess. But it also brings so much to the fore in terms of the experiences of Palestinians trying to live and love and make art while under occupation. And it's gorgeous while also being heartbreaking and probably not for everyone. I think I mentioned this in my book bracket video, that this is not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but it's like Isabella Hammad picked out every perfect aspect of a book for me and mashed it together. So this was very much perfect for me. And I just really, really loved it. I also loved that the protagonist is a little bit older. I believe she's in her late 30s or maybe early 40s at the beginning of the book. I loved this. Would highly recommend, especially if you're looking for books to read by Palestinian authors. So that was Enter Ghost, my 10th favorite book of the year. Then coming to number 9, we have The Longcut by Emily Hall. And ironically, this book has a not dissimilar writing style to Orbital by Samantha Harvey, which was one of my least, if not my absolute least favorite book of the year. Check out my worst books of 2024 video if you want to hear a little bit of my ranting. But this shares a similarity in that it has many very long run-on sentences with minimal punctuation. I will say The Longcut has a lot more commas, which I appreciated. They helped with following the very long sentences. It's a commentary on what art actually is. What is art? What is an artist? How do we define what our art is? How do we find our niche as an artist? You know, when you are a creative person, when you are an artist, how do you decide when you are creating art and when you are creating the scaffolding for art, or when you're just living, or when you're just making things, but the things you're making aren't actually art? This might sound convoluted, but if you are a creative, you've probably asked yourself these questions before. If you're a writer, if you are a visual artist, if you're a performance artist, there are times where you wonder if what you're making is actually art or not. Is it worth being made? Is there value in what you're making? Will anyone else care? Does it matter if anyone else cares? So again, this is a book that was very much well suited to me as someone who has always been creative, always been making stuff, making art, struggling with whether I feel right calling myself an artist or not. And there are very long run-on sentences, but in this case, the run-on sentences make sense because it's all the main character's inner monologue. And my interpretation as someone with ADHD reading it is that she has ADHD because her thought processes were very familiar to me. Very long run-on thoughts, lots of things that seem completely unrelated being mashed together, jumping from idea to idea, coming back to things, very circuitous thought patterns, repetitive thought patterns, and I could relate to that. And in this case, it made sense because it felt like that's how this person thinks. That's how her brain works. And to be fair, that's kind of how my brain works too. So I can't judge her for thinking that way, you know? And to be fair, I also was very frustrated by this book at first. I really struggled with it. I didn't know if I could make it through. It was very difficult to read. But as I got used to the writing style, I was picking up on more of the humor. This is a very funny book. It's a very relatable book. For me anyway, again, as someone with ADHD who has asked myself all these questions. And it felt much more lighthearted and much more almost anti-pretentious in that it's sort of poking fun at how pretentious artists can get trying to define their art and trying to talk about their art in this way. I just thought this was great. It felt very self-aware. So again, even though it has very long sentences, I felt like it made sense here. The style served the themes and the message of the book. So for anyone who watched my worst books video or that sci-fi video and were asking me if I just generally dislike really long sentences or sentences without a huge amount of punctuation, the answer is no. I'm not against that in general. I'm not really against any particular writing style or formatting style, but I have to like why it's being used and the context in which it's being used, you know? So anyway, I loved The Longcut. I thought this was great. I thought it was funny, relatable, insightful, poking fun at how pretentious and self-focused, self-centered artists can get sometimes. We can really get into our heads about our own art in a way that doesn't actually serve the creation of art. I thought this was very cutting and funny and entertaining once I got into the swing of things. So would highly recommend The Longcut if any of that sounds up your alley. Just keep in mind that you will probably have to push yourself to get through the first little bit until you get used to the writing style, because it is a bit of a challenge. Next up, my 8th favorite read of the year from the same video, my weird lit video, is The Weak Spot by Lucie Elven. This one is also a bit weird, but in a different way from The Longcut. This one is very sparse in a way The Longcut definitely isn't. It is light on the description, light on getting too excessive with the prose. It's quite spaced out, and those spaces contain a lot of subtext and a lot of meaning. And I really loved the experience of reading this and of sort of having to put on my detective hat and try to kind of parse out what the author was saying without actually saying it. Plot-wise, this is the story of our protagonist who goes to this little mountain town to work as a pharmacist or as a pharmacist's assistant, meets the various people in this town, forms connections, and is trying to kind of develop her career, trying to take after the pharmacist who she is studying under, while sort of simultaneously being suspicious of him for a variety of reasons. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil it, but I thought this was really great. I loved how sparse it was. I loved how vague it was while still being beautifully written and still being very evocative and creating vivid characters in a vivid setting and really being quite hard-hitting with the themes, while again allowing the reader, sort of having trust in the reader to meet the author where she was at and infer a lot of what was happening and read into, you know, little things said here and there, a look here, a touch there, and to sort of come to the right conclusion before the novel lets you in and sort of confirms for you what you've been building up to the whole time. I just thought it was a really great reading experience. This was a very unique book. I loved the themes. I loved the setting. I would love to read more from this author. I believe this was her debut, but I'm very glad that that bookseller gave this to me because I thought it was great. If that sounds interesting to you, check it out. Would highly recommend. Now for my 7th favorite read of the year, Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. And this was book 1 in a speculative fiction series that is what I would consider mostly sci-fi, but also has quite a bit of fantasy elements in it. This first book anyway is sort of a closed room mystery. And I just loved this book. I thought the world was fascinating. I was immediately intrigued by it and wanted to know all the tiny little details. And it felt like the author had really thought out all the details. It felt very full. I also found the characters really entertaining. It took me a little bit to get on board with Gideon, but once I did, I was kind of obsessed with her. She is a super tall, super ripped, badass warrior woman who is forced to become the cavalier, or basically personal bodyguard, to her least favorite person on the planet. And they have great banter. They hate each other so much, but they also grow to rely on each other in their own way. And they're forced to leave their home and go to an unfamiliar environment and forced to be in a situation with other cavaliers and necromancers to compete against them. And people keep dying. So it also turns into a bit of a mystery, a bit of a how do we survive this dangerous situation? And Gideon is building relationships and friendships, kind of building her own family for the first time in her life, coming out of her shell. And there's a lot of comedy and there's a lot of heart in this book and also in the sequel, which I've read. Would highly recommend this series and love how queer it is. There's so many queer characters and so many fantastic characters in general. I loved it. I thought it was great. My sixth favorite book of the year is A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. This one I read for my Reading Sequels of Books I Loved video, and I loved it. I thought it was amazing. Such intricate world building, such lovable and complex characters with really compelling relationships. I really appreciate how in-depth Samantha Shannon got with her world building, the political systems, the folk tales and fairy tales, the connection between different lands, the different religions, the different societal structures in the different countries within the larger world. I love this world. I love how complex it is. I love how detailed it is. I love all the many themes that Samantha Shannon is exploring through this duology. I absolutely love the characters. The characters are my favorite part by far. I am obsessed with them. I fell in love with every single one of them. I want to protect them all at all costs. I love that one of the most prominent point of view characters in this book is an older, middle-aged lesbian who is a badass and also incredibly compassionate and a wonderful parent and very kind and loving while still being, again, a total badass and incredible. I love a book with an older woman as a protagonist, and this one did such a great job. There's a lot of diversity in the characters represented, diverse array of relationships. There are a lot of themes here about parenthood and motherhood and women's place in society and how that's tied to our wombs and sort of pushing back against that idea while also having some really touching mother-child relationships. There's a lot about power and destiny and strength and coming of age. Two of the point of view characters are really sort of in their coming of age portion of their lives. And there's a lot about grief in here, which hit me at just the right time, both being very difficult, but also being quite healing for me, because I was in the middle of reading this when a family member passed away. And it was very challenging to read this book at that time because it does talk quite a bit about grief, but it also is always going to be special to me because it did help me through that earliest stage of grief in a way that I will always be grateful for, and I'll try not to cry. So highly recommend Day of Fallen Night. I would recommend reading The Priory of the Orange Tree first, and then reading A Day of Fallen Night. They're both fantastic. They're both great. Gave them both 5 stars. But this one is definitely a really fantastic read. My fifth favorite book of 2024 was Against the Loveless World, not Against the Loveless Sea. I kept calling it that in my book bracket video, but that's not what it's called. I merged together Against the Loveless World and Wide Sargasso Sea and made some sort of monstrous combination. But the book is Against the Loveless World by Susan Abulawa, and she is also a Palestinian author. And this is historical fiction about one woman's experiences living in many different countries as a displaced Palestinian woman with her family, trying to survive, trying to carve out a path in her life, trying to find happiness, trying to support her family through really difficult situations, and living as displaced Palestinians in various countries sort of around the area and struggling with never quite feeling like she belongs, never quite feeling like she's accepted, and sort of repeated situations of her family being driven out of communities or of countries altogether, and having to find a new place to call home and sort of start over. I feel like I keep describing it this way, but it really is the best way to describe it. This book is devastating. It has some really, really difficult subject matter to read about. I was heartbroken for this character. I was really struggling with reading it and had to put it down at several points, but I also just thought it was so gorgeously written. It was really beautifully written. It was very emotionally resonant. It was very piercing and heart-wrenching and real and raw. It didn't turn away from difficult situations that people are put into to survive. I thought the protagonist was such a strong person and such a complicated, complex character to follow. I thought it was very moving, and I don't think it's a book I'm going to forget anytime soon. This is another one I would highly recommend if you are wanting to support Palestinian authors. This one is absolutely fantastic, very difficult to read, but very worth the read, in my opinion. So, Against the Loveless World was my 5th favorite book of 2024. My 4th favorite read of 2024 was Let Us Descend by Jesmyn Ward. This is also historical fiction, but this is focused on looking at the life of a young Black girl born into slavery who is also, similar to the protagonist in Against the Loveless World, doing absolutely everything she can to survive through incredibly difficult circumstances. This is another one that is absolutely beautifully written, just gorgeous prose. It's very engaging and immersive, but it's also devastating. This book destroyed me emotionally. It is so hard to read about such a young person going through so much suffering so early in her life. Everything she had to endure, everything she had to survive. There is an element of the fantastic here, a little bit of a spiritual element, and it ties in some African mythology in a way that is very interesting. I also just found this protagonist so easy to love and root for and care about. I wanted her to make it out alive and as okay as humanly possible so badly. I was really invested because I needed to know she would be okay, and it was a really harrowing experience to read this book, but I'm very glad I did. Some beautiful imagery, some really poetic lines. The structure draws inspiration from Dante's Inferno and the Circles of Hell. The protagonist is a grief-stricken young girl trying to survive these ever-worsening circles of hell, and there is something sort of dreamlike and mythical about it, sort of in the same vein to oral storytelling, or has a similar quality to it. It is very hazy and dreamlike, especially with those fantastical folklore elements. I don't know. I feel like I've talked so much about it. I don't want to spoil anything. I just thought this was really gorgeous, and I'm very glad I read it, as hard as it was to get through, and I would highly recommend. So my 4th favorite book of 2024 was Let Us Descend by Jesmyn Ward. And now we've made it to my top 3 favorite reads of 2024, which, if you watched that book bracket video, you'll know gave me a lot of grief trying to decide between them, and trying to order them from 1 to 3 was very difficult, and I'm still second guessing myself. So just keep in mind that any of these 3 really could have been my favorite of the year. They could rearrange in any order and probably still be accurate. Probably most accurate to say it's a 3-way tie for my favorite of the year, but anyways, what I am saying is my 3rd favorite of the year is They're There by Tommy Orange. This story follows many different point of view characters who are all some form of urban Indian in Oakland, and they all have their own very distinct voice. At first, it's a bit overwhelming to have so many different point of view characters, but I felt anyway that I very quickly learned the voice of each character and felt attached to each character and was excited to read about each one when they came up sort of in the cycle of point of view characters. As much as it feels like so many different stories to follow and so many disparate experiences at the start, everything really comes together in the end in such a masterful yet completely devastating way. It also has some really sharp commentary about what it means to be an urban Indian, what it means to be an Indigenous person living in the modern United States, what Indigenous identity means to different people, and the challenges of finding community and healing as a community. I felt like this was so poignant and very straightforward in a way that I really appreciate in the message it was trying to convey in its themes. But Orange also created some of the most vivid characters that I have read in a long time, and I was absolutely 100% invested in their fate and wanting to know that they would turn out okay and be safe and happy and that all their dreams would come true. I'm not going to say too much. I don't want to spoil it. Please go read this book, but it is devastating emotionally, and especially valuable in that not that stories that explore Indigenous people in history are not valuable, because they certainly are, but I think there is a bit of a trend in publishing to amplify historical fiction about Indigenous people, but not necessarily contemporary fiction that explores what it means to be Indigenous in the modern day and living with the ramifications and the generational trauma that have come as a result of occupation and genocide and many years of racism and mistreatment and disenfranchisement. And I think it's a valuable perspective, and I also think Tommy Orange delivered it in such a poignant and clever and emotionally piercing way. So I love this book. Highly recommend There by Tommy Orange. I'm very excited to read the prequel, I believe it is, Wandering Stars. I'm not sure I'm ready emotionally yet, but I'm excited to read it. Now moving on to my second favorite book of the year, my runner-up, which was I Cheerfully Refuse by Leif Enger. I read this book for my sci-fi reading vlog and fell apart sobbing when I finished it on camera, so you can go watch that if you want to see me cry. This was everything. It's gorgeous and devastating. It was beautiful. This is sci-fi in the way that not everyone agrees with it being called sci-fi, in that it's a post-societal collapse, beginning of the apocalypse sort of sci-fi story with a little bit of advanced technology, in the pharmaceutical industry at least, but otherwise feels very much at our current level of technological advancement and happening on Earth with no major changes. But this really explores what our world could look like in the next 10 years, depending on choices made by politicians in the US and Canada. This takes place right on the border, essentially, between the US and Canada, right on the Great Lakes. The main character was quiet and reserved, but also very relatable and lovable to me. His story is full of grief and struggle and rage and survival, but it's also full of joy and love and discovery and hope. And as much as this book broke me and made me cry so much and was kind of terrifying in how realistic it felt for, the near future, it also was somehow hopeful and did make me feel like maybe even if the worst case scenario were to happen, maybe it could turn out okay. And I just really loved the protagonist. I loved his relationship with someone he meets along his journey, and this book made me feel a lot of feelings, and I thought it was beautifully written, and I loved it. So those are my thoughts. 5 stars. This was my second favorite book of 2024. And that brings us to my absolute favorite read of the year, which was Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler. This is book 2 in a duology, and it's incredible. I don't know what to tell you. Octavia E. Butler was a genius. This duology is a masterpiece. This duology, in a very similar vein to I Cheerfully Refuse, is a near future examination of what could happen as climate change and societal unrest, class inequality, rampant capitalism sort of meet and explode. This one is a much more visceral, raw, violent in some ways. I mean, I Cheerfully Refuse also has some violence, but this one is more overt in its violence. It also has more religious themes, but it's just a masterpiece. I don't know what to tell you. If you haven't read this duology, what are you doing with your life? They were written in the 90s, but predicted the future in a way that feels unsettling. Octavia E. Butler's prescience is unmatched in my experience, and there's just so much social commentary here. There's so much humanity and really deep exploration of the flaws and foibles of humanity and the ways that we just love to self-destruct and the ways that we can pull everyone down with us or attempt to find love, find community, find family in the midst of everything going up in flames around you and what that looks like. And this one also, similarly to I Cheerfully Refuse, absolutely destroyed me and ripped my heart out of my chest and stomped on it a couple times. But then it stuffed it back in my chest cavity and put a band-aid on it and tried at least a little bit, to give me hope for a possible better future in a way that didn't leave me feeling absolutely broken, sobbing on the floor, but nearly. So I don't know what to say about it. I thought it was incredible. I love the characters in this story. I love how complicated they are. I love how flawed they are. I love how real they feel. I love how sharp this is in its commentary. I love how unafraid Butler was to say what she meant with her whole chest and call out harmful systems, from religion to politics to ignoring climate change. And she was saying all of this in the 90s in a way that feels even more relevant today than it did back then. And it's kind of scary, but also so deeply relevant and so worth the read. If you haven't read this duology, have I convinced you yet? Because I can keep going. Do you need me to keep talking, or are you just going to trust me and go buy this duology? I think it should be the latter. Okay, anyway, this was my favorite read of the year. I struggled so much to pick between There, I Cheerfully Refuse, and Parable of the Talents, but at the end of the day, this book is in my mind, a classic, a modern classic, I suppose. And Octavia Butler is up there as one of my all-time favorite authors of all time. And I am not being hyperbolic when I call her a genius. I truly believe she was a genius. And I'm getting emotional thinking about the fact that she's no longer with us and no longer able to keep writing books like this, because what a loss. I am very glad she wrote so much in her lifetime that I still have to read, but I'm kind of terrified to continue reading through her work and eventually reach the end. So it's a bit of a catch-22. Anyway, I'm getting emotional, so I'm gonna stop. Those were my top 12 favorite books of 2024. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like, maybe share it with a friend, help my video do well in the algorithm. Subscribe if you haven't already. If you watched this whole video and got to this point, I feel like we should be friends, and therefore you should subscribe. If you missed my book bracket video and you wanna hear me struggle so hard with choosing my favorites, and also hear me talk about more of my favorites of the year that didn't make it to this list, all of the other 5-star reads of the year basically, and quite a few 4-star reads, check out that video. It's a fun one, it's classic, it's a tradition on this channel. If you wanna hear me rant about books I was disappointed by or hated, you can check out my top 10 most disappointing books of the year and my top 10 worst books of the year. They will also be linked in the description box. And I'm very excited to announce that I'll be doing a series on my channel over the next couple months, however long it takes me to get through all the genres, of my favorites of all time, separated by genre, starting with fantasy, going to sci-fi, horror, literary fiction, historical fiction, romance, nonfiction, classics, etc., so that I can share favorites from both my time making bookish content, but also before, and just be able to compile my favorites in one place for your reference if you want to build a TBR, if we have similar taste, and, you know, just for people coming across my channel who might not have watched all the backlog to quickly get a feel for what I like. That's something that has been requested quite a few times recently, but also, you know, several times in the past, and I finally decided this was the time to do it. So watch out for those videos. My loose plan is to publish them every other Wednesday until we get to the end of all the possible genres that I can think of. So if you want to see those and you're not subscribed already, subscribe. Maybe turn on notifications so you know when I post a new video. I'm very excited about that series, although it is involving me choosing even more favorites from amongst many books I love, which, as you know, especially if you watched my book bracket video, is something I'm not very good at, but I did it for you. So those videos are coming. I'm very excited about it. I hope you are too. And with that, I'm gonna get going. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.